Kia ta whakatere I te waka, kei pariparia e te tai. Ka molene hui te kura, ka whakamaro te atu. Ka whakaoki mai ki te kapua whakapipi. Ka tua ke au I kona ki te mihi atu ki a koutou. Kia koutou e rau rangatira mā, ko hui mai nei I tēnei rā. Kia koutou, te whānau Sāmi, ka tū mātou I wainganui a koutou. Koutou no ngā whenua katoa, tēnā koutou, kia ora koutou katoa. I stand here to acknowledge that we are in Sami land and to greet everybody who's come here from so many different places. It's such an honour to be here. The way we start in our culture, I'm Māori, I'm from New Zealand, is that we talk about where we're from. We don't really care what anybody does. We're like, tongariro te maunga, taupo te moana, tūwhare tō te iwi, te hehu te tangata. My mountain is Tongariro, my lake is Taupo, my tribe is Ngāti Tūwhare Toa, my chief is Te Hehu. And so I welcome you here today. It's an honour to facilitate this. Indigenous Journalists Association have brought me up here from the bottom of the South Pacific. I believe I've come the furthest than any other human at this whole festival. I woke up this morning and thought it was 12:15 in the afternoon, got dressed, rushed outside and realised it was 12:15 at midnight. So I'm a coiled spring. And today we are going to talk about Indigenous journalism. We're going to look at investigative journalism. We're going to look at some tools and techniques, but also some challenges that we face as journalists. But first I'd really like to start off by inviting my whānau. Whānau in our language means family. These people that we've been hanging with since we got here a couple of days ago. Indigenous journalists doing amazing work. And I want them to explain or introduce themselves to you, where they come from, their nation, and what makes them who they are. So, kia ora, everyone.
Hi, my name is Tristan Atone. I'm a member of the Kiowa tribe of Oklahoma. I'm from the U.S. I'm a reporter at GRIST. We're a nonprofit, climate-focused outlet. I run the Indigenous Affairs Desk at GRIST, and I'm very happy to be here with this panel.
Kia ora, Tristan. Tuhi?
Oh, okay. Hi, Inamayan. My name is Tuhi. It's my traditional name, Tuhi Matugal. Tuhi is from my great-grandmother, and Matugal is the name of the worship house we have back home. I'm from Taiwan. I'm from the Binuyumayan peoples, and from the Gazbagan community. Well, actually, I'm coming from the social movement and indigenous rights movement background. And I used to work for the Indigenous TV in Taiwan for almost 6 years. And then I tried to go to politics for around 3 years. And then I realized that's not something for me. So I came back to media. But now I'm no longer working for Indigenous media, but I'm now working for mainstream media and try to navigate myself to see how can I also cover some of the messages about Indigenous peoples and also like the concerns we have and the challenges we have in the mainstream media, and also to make the audience in Taiwan to get used to my Indigenous name, which is already a challenge because I had to not really fight, but I had to really argue with the managers in my company to tell them why I need to use my Indigenous name on the screen instead of my Chinese name. And they gave me all this reason saying that it's too difficult for the audience to read, it's difficult for the audience to pronounce, and all these things. But then it turned out to be the audience, they can learn because they call me by my Indigenous name and they send me message with my Indigenous name and spell it just correctly. So yeah, that's something I'm trying to do, and yeah, and then I will share a bit more later though.
Kia ora, Tuhi.
Thank you.
Hi everyone, my name is Brittany Guido. I'm a member of the Dene Suline First Nation in Manitoba, Canada. I've been an investigative journalist for about 4 years, just over 4 years now. At APTN Investigates, it's we produce 30-minute documentaries on Indigenous issues, and that's me.
So when we come together as Indigenous peoples, there's this natural convergence because we have the same experience of colonisation. We have colonised minorities in our own land, and we're dealing with systemic issues. We're part of movements in our own countries. Certainly I can speak from Aotearoa, New Zealand. There are advocates in health, justice, education, politics, media, who are trying to decolonise those spaces, trying to brown them up, trying to make them relevant. And as Indigenous people, we share the same values, the same belief systems, that we are all connected to everything, to people, to the land. We heard one of our panellists yesterday speak about Earth Mother and Sky Father. This is how we see our world. We have that same colonising experience, which is traumatic, but these beliefs and these values that we share are the enabling, exciting, positive ones that many of us believe are the answers to some of the most serious issues that we're facing, all people nowadays. Our world views and our accountabilities to each other as humans, as being part of an ecosystem, not above it, what is driving a lot of us. And of course, it's all about relationships. So we are members of collectives, of communities, where accountabilities to our ancestors and to our descendants. That's certainly how Māori and Polynesians see the world. Is that something that's familiar to you, Tristan?
Yeah, I think it's very, very similar in how we sort of think of our place in the world and our relationships. I think is also one of the major things that makes Indigenous journalism quite different than Western forms of journalism, is really incorporating these ideas about relationship, about why you do what you do, and who you're serving. And I think those are those ideas are really interweaved with everybody's work here, especially the other Indigenous journalists that have come here as well too, is that it is what separates our work quite distinctly.
Is that the same for you, Tuhi?
Yes, and well, I think one thing is that because back home in Taiwan, as I said earlier, the other day, that when I was working for Indigenous TV in Taiwan is funded by the government, so it's actually quite difficult for us to really dig into like some of the issues that is relevant to the government, because we got the money from the government and then we're saying something bad about the government. But what I did in the past is that we try to find the stories in the other Indigenous societies, in other communities. But actually, when we're talking about the stories of others, those are the stories of ours, because we share all this common, as you said, the colonial history, the memories, and also all these experiences we have. It's very easy for us to connect to each other's experiences, and also, in a way, it's a path for us to reconciliate ourselves among different Indigenous societies. So yeah, I can really echo to that.
I think sometimes in Indigenous peoples, we look at our own space, and it's when we travel and we find others, we think, oh heck, there's a whole platoon of us out there with the same kind of perspective. Brittany, how did you end up in journalism anyway?
It's it's kind of a longer story how I got into journalism. I actually went to university for criminal justice and was partway through my degree, and I was offered a job at APTN as a news department assistant. So it was really doing administrative tasks for the news department there, and it sort of just snowballed from there. They asked me if I had any ideas for news stories, and so I went home that day and thought of everything I could think of and how it related to my experience in university and what I wrote about there, because it really focused on Indigenous topics as a writer. And so I came back the next day and presented what I thought I could do, and I did them that summer. And
So they didn't say to you, "Oh, those are great stories. Thank you. We'll go and do those." They said, "Oh, go, girl."
Exactly.
Yeah.
It really was an empowering experience, and from there it just really snowballed. I was offered a lot of other opportunities, and doors were sort of opened for me in a way that I hadn't experienced before in any other organization. And so it's just an empowering experience.
Tristan, did you train as a journalist, or did someone tap you on the shoulder and say, "Come over here, we've got a job for you"?
No, I actually, originally, almost my entire life, I actually wanted to be an artist. So I went to art school. I went to a college called the Institute of American Indian Arts, where I was in the painting program. I had to take an elective course in creative writing, and I happened to take a journalism course. More or less sort of got the bug there in terms of learning about journalism and learning what to do. I think one of the big moments for me was that when I was a student there, the students were always complaining about food on campus. And that's nothing new. The university, cafeterias are not great. But there was really something specific that I was interested in, that all the students said that the food tasted old. So I just thought I'd go check it out and ask the chefs what was going on. So I walked down to the cafeteria. It wasn't like Spotlight or anything. I just asked the cook why was everybody complaining about this. And it turned out that the program had this was right after September 11th, basically. And they had an emergency preparedness program where the school would put food out on the shelves, and when it was about to go bad, they'd feed it to the students so that they could put new food on the shelf, like beans and rice and stuff like that, so that if there was a lockdown situation, students could survive on campus up to a year.
That was your first investigative piece.
Yeah, I thought it was pretty interesting.
That's
So
great.
I wrote the whole thing up, and basically the next week the administration was like, "We're going to stop doing this. We're not going to do this anymore.
Wow.
We're really sorry about this." And I was like, "Oh wow, that's interesting what journalism can do." It also helped that I learned there was a really terrible painter. So these two things happened at the same time, and it was it was all journalism.
Did you get elected student president or something after that? Because that was pretty powerful.
I actually did.
Oh, well.
But then I went to journalism school after that.
So you learned all those techniques. What about you, Tuhi?
Well, actually, when I was little, I always wanted to become a musical actress. But then one day I realized I cannot sing.
This is good to know. Some people don't realise.
I realized that when I was young, in a very early age. And then I wanted to become a diplomat, especially given to the fact that Taiwan is in a very tricky status internationally. So I started to go to United Nations in 2006 until 1 year before, until the year of the pandemic. I stopped going there. But then it just at United Nations, you just really feel the pressure and also all this international politics. That's why I had this. I had this thought that I can become a politician, but then no, it's different. But anyway, so I wanted to become a diplomat in United Nations to represent Indigenous peoples from Taiwan. But then it didn't happen until now because I cannot even deliver a statement by saying that I'm from Taiwan. Taiwan is a forbidden word in United Nations. And but because of this participation in the United Nations for 16, 17 years, I built up a lot of friendship with indigenous peoples around the world. And then when I finished my master's degree in Germany, I came back to Taiwan. And because I have these experiences that is quite rare, obviously, for Taiwanese, especially for indigenous peoples in Taiwan. So the Indigenous TV, they approached me and asked me if I want to do something about international indigenous news with them. That's why I got into the Indigenous TV and started covering indigenous news around the world. And by doing that, it also brought me further closer to my indigenous brothers and sisters around the world, because with journalism, I can, in a way, tell their stories. So I have another channel to share and also to really broadcast the issues, the causes, and also the real demand of people, even though it's not like an international platform, but still there's some channel that we can do it. And that was the time I realized how powerful news can be to really spread the word and also to become a tool for social movement. But because of that, I also realized how fragile it could be, because I do have some friends and families, after they interviewed, they were harassed. And I even got a friend, he was shot, but luckily he survived. But that's the reality we're facing still nowadays around the world.
It's a tremendous conference, this, for some of us to come here and see the courageous journalists coming from different countries that are facing things that we can barely imagine. Coming from New Zealand, I always think we're always moaning about how tough it is down there to get our voices heard, but we don't face the same kinds of challenges that others do. Recent research has shown that in countries colonised by Britain, dear Queen, news has consistently and deliberately represented Indigenous people as violent, primitive and unworthy. Now, in New Zealand in 2020, the biggest media platform, it's called Stuff, they had 20 reporters analyse 160 years worth of coverage to look at how Māori, as Indigenous people of New Zealand, were covered, and it ended up being this huge, very public apology from this media platform. For example, they found that the phrase Māori radical was used 500 times in Māori activist, 2,000 times compared to Pākehā, which is our word for white activists, have been 15 times. So the way that issues have been played out was it was helping to form the narrative, the worldview of how New Zealanders viewed Māori. And so this platform did this huge piece of work, apologised and said, we're going to do better. They brought on more Indigenous journalists, they brought on Indigenous editors, and they've been working towards that. It is a work in progress. In New Zealand, we found out that the number of journalists had halved between 2006 and 2018. So the government brought in a public interest journalism fund to grow cadets, to attract young people into the industry and move them around. So Māori television, we took some cadets, then they'd go and work at Stuff, then they'd go and work at the state television, and they'd move around, trying to get them interested in journalism, because as speakers here have said, it's not exactly something that everyone's knocking themselves out to get into. They'd rather be on TikTok being influencers. So it also has helped us build and bring non-Indigenous mentors and allies into our midst to help build our capability. So just before we get into talking about stories, Tristan, I just wonder, have you had any of those experiences in the States? Has that happened where people have looked back and looked at how Indigenous stories, Indigenous people are being misrepresented?
I think it's happening more and more. I obviously have to credit the Indigenous Journalists Association for continuing to keep an eye on how mainstream and non-Indigenous outlets cover Indian country and Indigenous communities. But I do think that the sort of wall that we continue to run into in terms of being able to do that kind of analysis and have that kind of accountability is that it seems to be quite common in the U.S. that mainstream outlets have policies that say we don't apologize for stories. So even when it's factually inaccurate, even when the analysis is harmful or hurtful, it's almost impossible to get a news outlet to apologize for its coverage, whether it's happening right now or if it's happening historically. And I think that that model of moving people around and trying to encourage the next generation is obviously what I'm hearing a lot here at this conference, which is really, really great. But technically, it's cheaper to exploit our stories than it is to train us to come in and do it more accurately. So it's easier to parachute a reporter into any community in the U.S. to do a story about that community than it is to train somebody up to do an accurate job, to put in the time, to find an editor who wants to actually put in time to work with a young reporter. It's more or less exploitation brings in more money and is cheaper for a news organization than it is to actually be training people up, at least in the United States. So I think that is something to keep in mind about when we're talking about next generation of journalists. It seems like that's a conversation that's happening here. And in the U.S., it's happening very rarely, and I think is more of a bias.
So in New Zealand, Brittany, we have Māori platforms. So we have radio, we have 21 tribal stations, we have Māori television, which I'm a part of. These were fought for. No one handed, the government never went, oh gosh, you guys should have this, We had to take them to court and do all this sort of advocacy. But the push has been to have independent Māori platforms, but also transform the existing platforms to colour them up a bit, to get more of a co-governance thing, to get more Māori in those positions. What's the state in Canada? What's happening over there?
So I work for APTN, and it's the only Indigenous broadcaster in the country. There are a few other, I believe there's only one other Indigenous investigative unit, or Indigenous unit. It's not even an investigative unit in the country. So yeah, kind of building on what Tristan was saying is that there aren't really a whole lot of Indigenous journalists, investigative Indigenous journalists at that. And yeah, one of the things that I think is missing is mentorship and training Indigenous journalists to take on those stories instead of going that exploitative route.
And it's the time. I think that's what everybody at the conference was talking about, the time and skills, the tools, the access to so many things to build investigations, because they take a long time, don't they?
Oh, absolutely. The resources, the money, the time, having staff to take on the stories is something that, I can speak to. I've done so many stories where I think that the quality of the stories could be so much greater if we had more people to work on it, more brain power, just the resources to go out and get those stories. Canada is such a large country. It's just something that's missing.
How about Taiwan, Judy?
Well, in Taiwan, I have to say the topics about Indigenous peoples got very popular recent years among mainstream media as well. But for me, I won't say that they really care. Well, maybe some of them they really care about the issues or all the problems we have. But one of the reasons why it got so popular is because it's a topic that get people to win awards. Yeah, because because with all this topic, it's a story that is very, I don't know. Yeah, easy to get awarded. So we do have
really.
So it's like I think just as Trishan said that it's kind of taking, it's another way of taking advantage of us or of our trauma, our stories, and then make it into something it's easier for them to sell. And also for some of people to get famous with. That's one problem with the media in Taiwan regarding indigenous peoples. And the other thing is that they tend to emphasize the status, or for example, if there's a crime they are reporting on, they will really emphasize if this person is of indigenous background and if this person is raised by his or her grandparents or a single parent or the second or third generation of immigrant workers, something like that. They tend to really emphasize all this status in reports regarding crimes. So that's still another problem that we're still facing. And of course, all these stereotypes as indigenous people are good at singing, which I'm not, and all these things. So I don't know, like in this around 10 years of working in media in Taiwan, I still say, of course, there's a lot of people, they want to get involved into indigenous journalism, but I don't know if they have really this, in a way, correct or this mindset that it's not something for them, maybe for some of the non-indigenous journalists, it's something for them to get involved with, but for us, it's not by our choice to be involved with, it's our daily lives. And this is very different perspective when we are looking at all this report, even though it's just a short news clip for 1 minute and 30 seconds in daily news regarding typhoon, regarding landslides. It still make difference, like how the perspective. So yeah, that's the challenge we still have.
Oh, so many challenges, isn't it? Crikey. So Tristan, let's talk about a story that you champion. So we want to unpack a particular story that you did, which was huge and fascinating in its scope and in its depth, and in just reading it and thinking, wow, I was knocked out by that. And can you just explain to our colleagues out here the particular story that you'd like to talk about?
Sure. The story is called Land Grant Universities. It was a piece that we worked on at High Country News in the U.S. That came out 2020 and still having some fairly wide impacts. Basically, what we wanted to look at was the university system in the U.S., specifically institutions called land-grant universities. The history on these land-grant universities are big research and public institutions in the U.S. That were more or less formed in the 1800s by President Abraham Lincoln through a particular act called the Morrill Act. More or less, it gave land to universities to sell and to raise money for their endowments. Our investigation more or less asked the question, where did they get their land? No surprise, it came from indigenous nations. So what we did was go through and going through public records, libraries, national archives. I think we used something like a dozen different data sets to pull together where these actual parcels were. We more or less found that it was 80,000 parcels, more or less, about 10.7 million acres of land that were given to these universities by the federal government, that were taken from 250 different indigenous nations through about 160 different violence-backed land sessions for the benefit of 52 universities. So we went through, located every single piece of land. We joined it to land session data that was available through the federal government, and then did analysis on what that money actually looked like. So what we came up with was about $500 million that those universities made off of that land by the early 19th or early 20th century. And that may not seem like a lot of money, but remember, you have to remember that these institutions had like 20 people in their very first classes that they're opening. So like these universities that are premier universities in the U.S. could not exist without this seed money. So what we're looking at here is more or less a wealth transfer from indigenous nations to colleges. And I think one of the big things that we heard a lot in getting that project off the ground, we tried to partner actually with a lot of other outlets who told us that this was just a history project and that they didn't really want anything to do with it. It was, it belonged in academia. I think this is what illustrates again what's different about indigenous journalists is that history is not something that's in a box that you open later. It has long-term ripple effects on our communities. And again, one of the big things that we also found in the reporting was that there were about, I think there were still 50,000 acres that these universities hadn't actually sold that were still making money. So we can trace provenance of these very, very quickly to tribes and look at the money that they're still producing for institutions so that this isn't historical. This is something that we can point to right here, right now, tribal land that is producing revenue for institutions. And that's more.
And so, were you the first ones, or were there other stories similar that kind of triggered your interest? How did you decide on this particular piece?
Well, it came about working with the team, but in the past there have been some theoretical flagging of this issue through academics of saying that land grant institutions owe their origins to indigenous lands, but being able to actually programmatically pull the data and show the receipts for every single acre was something that hadn't been done before and basically couldn't be done in the past because of the nature of just using ArcGIS these days. So, I guess somebody could have done it in the past, but it probably would have taken years to be able to go through every single one of these pieces of land. We had to manually enter almost half of the land into ArcGIS from 18th century documents to figure this out. I can see your face there. It was really bad. It was bad.
How many people in your team?
Basically about, we had 6 people on the team and we had 4 interns that we were able to bring on to help with data.
And so how did you find the documents? How did you find that information that you needed?
The U.S. keeps some very good documentation in the early 19th and 18th century on land records, and especially around tribal land. We also had something called the Indian Claims Commission in the 1940s all the way up in actually until the 1990s that resolved land claims by tribes, where the federal government would actually put down how much money they spent for land, where it was, etc. They are very disparate data sets to pull this together. Most of them are archival stuff, but for the federal government to give a university land, they more or less had to identify it. So we had to go and look at where that piece of land was on the public grid and enter it.
And were there any surprises?
It still continues to produce surprises. One of the big things that we did with the investigation is that we wanted to make an open source investigation. So we put all of our information publicly on GitHub so that you could download it. So all of our ArcGIS files are there, the shape files, we have all of our financial files. Basically, you can do anything that you want with the work. You can pull down everything that we used. Nothing that we use in the investigation is private. Everything it was all from public records. And I think the biggest surprise was how much impact. We didn't expect it to have much impact. It's still being used for a number of institutions in terms of their incoming classes to talk about their universities. Academics and researchers have used it for all sorts of interesting projects, from thinking through like what land bases look like in non-capitalist ways of like valuing lands, all the way up to pushing for tuition for students, free tuition for Native students at universities. We've seen 4 different land grant institutions move to have free tuition for Native students whose tribes were impacted by this law. We've seen a ton of stuff just happen with it and continue to happen because the big thing was that we made it public. Our reporting is more or less the curated version, and then the choose your own adventure is if you download it and play with it basically. And I think that's a model that we're really interested in terms of Indigenous reporters. Of like, we want everybody to be playing with this stuff. We want everybody to be jumping into it. And the amount of impact that happens when everybody can play along is just massively different than trying to sort of like corral something privately. And then hoping that people trust you enough to do a good job.
What sort of tools or techniques did you employ in that investigation for the first time?
Basically everything. This was the first big data sort of investigation I'd worked on. So it's using our GIS. It's using a lot of like mapping tools and technology. I think the biggest thing that I learned on that investigation was hiring the people who know how to do this stuff really well. I know that sounds like a no-brainer, but
yeah, but you got to be able to have the resources to do that too, don't you?
Well, that helps also. Being able to fundraise, I've learned a lot of development to be able to get that project off the ground. The entire story, I think we probably did that for about $40,000 total, which is to some degree a fairly small amount for large investigations that take 2 years. But just had to learn how to fundraise, had to learn how to hire the right people. I don't know how to use our GIS, so I hire people who can't do it. I learn along the way with them, but there are things that I just don't know how to do, and it's easier for me to try and find somebody who's an expert in this, and usually Indigenous people who are experts in this, hire them, bring them into the team, and build teams. Sometimes non-journalists, journalists, academics, our team is researchers, academics, photographers. We had a kind of ragtag. It's more of an Ocean's 11 style team. Disparate backgrounds coming together.
Yeah, and that takes some skill to coordinate and, as you say, reach out, identify the right people, the right skills that you need, and to pull the team together. So it took 2 years. At the end of that, are there things now that you sort of think, well, if only we had this. If only we had this little tool or technique. If we only had this human. Is there anything?
I mean, yeah. I think, we're working on a follow-up story now that dives into a different set of data that's quite similar. I think really one of the big things that we learned on that is just a lot better organization. In the end, it was more or less 3 people working on this project. We had to really learn organization, everything on the job very quickly. Nowadays, it's a lot. We know kind of what to do now. We can
get your template.
Yeah, we have the template. We can fact check the data a lot earlier before we send it out to partners. We can do, really think through the cartography before it happens. At one point during the investigation, we realized that New Mexico hadn't provided all the data, so we had to enter like another 150,000 acres of land into the database for like 2 weeks to go to publication, and this is essentially why I'm starting to get gray hair. It's like, it was really stressful to do that. And I think basically it was a growth process to know what to do next, how to manage that project, and how to get that together, which was something that I was never trained on doing, and just had to learn on the job.
Was there a role there for non-Indigenous allies in that process, in that investigation?
Yeah, definitely. We work with a lot of non-Indigenous journalists on investigations and stories, but the big deal is that these kind of pieces need to be Indigenous. We need to make sure that we have people who are thinking through how we're treating sources, how we're looking at arts, how every little bit of that needs to be thought through by an Indigenous team who's more or less Indigenous. Which is, again, why I think we've had so much success with this, because it is so very different than other investigative stories that tackle Indigenous topics. For instance, this story doesn't mention the word poverty ever, because it's not a part of the story, right? You don't really see that in a lot of non-Indigenous-led investigations or stories that aren't looking at, statistics in areas that usually talk about differences and disparities. We're looking at how this particular piece of legislation impacted our communities and continues to enrich institutions at our expense. That is quite different than looking at a problem within an Indigenous community from non-Indigenous ones.
And just to finally, I'm just wondering, what was the impact? What was the outcome in terms of those institutions? How did they respond?
As I mentioned, some have started moving to tuition remission programs, which is very heartening to see. Others just ignored it. So this is I think this is the one thing that I'm sure everybody in the room has dealt with as investigative reporters is that large institutions can just ignore the work, even though you're showing up with the receipts kind of thing. We still have a number of institutions that have never even acknowledged their institution's role in this particular piece of legislation. We're still waiting on comment 2 years later from some universities. Some have actually responded in the last year, which is really interesting. We see it just, the whole southern United States, they just don't care at all. It's no impact there. But in other parts, we see a lot of land acknowledgments where universities are looking at this. It's open investigations. It's open up projects at other universities. But I think the big thing is that's when you're showing up with the receipts to a university and just shrug and say whatever, it raises questions about what that university is up to. I think if you're in an institution that thinks that truth and openness are really huge parts of your institution, and you show up and say, "Hey, you guys benefited from 20 human rights violations, and you're still making money off it," they say, this is a question, a deeper question of the United States generally.
And a point I'll just add in your story was that some of that land that has been taken is still making heaps of money for those institutions through contracts around mining and rentals and things like that.
Yeah, this is our follow-up. Looking at a similar act that's still on the books and that universities are benefiting from now. We're tracking another about 6 million acres of land that are being used by universities at this time. We've tracked about $2.2 billion that have come out of these lands specifically for 14 universities over the last 5 years. It's a significant amount of money when you think that the annual budget for 33 tribal colleges in the U.S. is something like $1 billion in 1 year. The amount of money that's coming out of Indigenous lands to support non-Indigenous students is quite massive.
Thanks, Tristan. We have this. I was just doing a little quick Google yesterday after reading your story, and I thought, oh the hell, look at our universities in New Zealand. There's been some work done on those too. Land that's been confiscated from, what did they used to call it? Something natives, hostile, something like that, and they confiscate the land. Next minute there's a university, or place universities in areas where they wanted to grow the settlements. So that's an ongoing project in New Zealand too. Now, Brittany, your work, you did an extensive investigation. Could you please share with us the issue that you looked at and how you went about it?
So I worked on a story called Black Robes. I spent just a few months working on it, basically where I obtained just under 200 court records that helped identify approximately 100 Catholic Church alleged abusers at residential schools. And so for those of you who don't know what residential schools were, basically they were institutions that were designed as schools for Indigenous kids, and the main goal was really to just assimilate into the population. And so there was a lot of abuse that went on at these schools. Children were made to cut their hair. Hair for Indigenous people is known as something sacred. They couldn't go home at the end of the day. They were given numbers on their clothing, that sort of thing. So these lawsuits, they were all filed by Indigenous people who went to these schools as kids and claimed various levels of abuse, mental, physical, sexual abuses that had happened at various institutions in Canada. And so a few years after these lawsuits were filed, Canada's largest class action lawsuit in history was underway to compensate survivors. So I spoke with several survivors for this story who said that their alleged abusers should have been criminally investigated, and they never were. That was part of the class action lawsuit, was that none of the alleged abusers would be investigated in that way. So these court documents, they showed that some priests and some nuns from the Catholic Church these alleged abusers were in more than 30 separate lawsuits. So certain names would appear multiple times. And that was pretty shocking to see just how many times, how many people would name a specific person.
How did you obtain those documents? Was that a big job to find those, to be able to pull those out of the system?
Yeah, actually, it was quite tedious. I was lucky that in Manitoba, the province where I did the investigation, where I'm from, we have all our court records online, so you can just go online and search into the database and retrieve all the records. It's not the case for all the provinces and territories in Canada where you can do that. So I sort of lucked out in that sense. But yeah, it took quite a long time to go through all those documents. There was probably about 12,000 pages. And it was just myself working on the story and one intern that I had for a week. So it took quite a bit of time.
And are you doing other stories or investigations at the same time, or were you able to focus on just that?
It was just that investigation. Sometimes our news department likes to pull us over for a couple of weeks to do some daily news, but that's about it. I was lucky that I was able to just kind of focus all my attention on that one story at the time. What
particular tools or techniques did you employ in that investigation that were helpful?
So I would say basically going through the court documents, finding different ways to search. It's not like you can just search a name in the registry. So I just started searching different Catholic, different church denominations to figure out how many lawsuits there would be and if there was a story there. And I quickly found that there was. Another tool that I used was going through the local archives. So I found that the Oblates of Mary Immaculate have quite an extensive archival record-keeping sort of thing going on, and that was really, really helpful in terms of finding photos, figuring out if they were still, if the priests were still alive. So yeah.
And was there anything now when you look back that you thought you could have used, like apart from more humans on your investigation? Was there particular tools or something that you thought would have been helpful at the time?
So many things. I mean, having more time, definitely. I only had a few months to work on the story. The money to take a look at the whole country. I was only able to do Manitoba for this investigation. And in Canada, there's 10 provinces, 3 territories. So there's quite a wide scape of documents to go through that I just wasn't able to do. Just the sheer volume of documentation is just something that I couldn't handle. It really would have taken a whole team to do that.
What was the impact of that story? What happened when it came out?
The impact, there really wasn't an impact, and I think that's because there's a lack of interest in Indigenous storytelling, issues that impact Indigenous people.
The resident school issue, and it's the same in New Zealand, where we have an inquiry into abuse in state care, which those people who have been through those institutions as young people resile from the word care, because there was much abuse and much torture that's been acknowledged, and we have these hearings now where the survivors of these institutions, who often went into them as young people, are able to speak to a panel, and their evidence is captured. People who went through 1950 to about 1995, and it's just had, like in Canada, the most traumatic impact on their lives, shaped their lives. And I think in our country it's only just been understood, the impact that that's had on generations. How was it for the people that you spoke with?
A lot of people were really reluctant to tell their stories, and I think that stems a lot from the inquiry that happened in Canada. There really wasn't a lot in terms of the outcome that happened with the inquiry. There was a settlement, and people were issued compensation, but I still felt that there was a reluctance to tell the story, and I think a lot of that is because they weren't believed. People didn't believe their stories were true, and that's still the case today.
Now, Tuhi, tell us about a story that you've been involved in, that you were really invested in, that took some time for you, and where you learned something as well.
Okay, so it's actually back in 2017. I made a story about a dam project in the Philippines. But I just need to, the background to that is that actually at that time I was not intended to make a story out of that, because that was a student project that we brought a group of Indigenous students to the Philippines, and then we do an exchange program with youth organizations, Indigenous youth organizations there, and to learn different skills from each other. And the youth organization in the Philippines, they asked us if we can make a documentary for these 2 specific communities, because these 2 specific communities, they are going to be affected by a dam project that is proposed by both the Filipino government in cooperation with Norwegian power companies called Ace and Aboitids. And also these 2 communities are so remote that for the one we went to is I had to take from Manila to Baguio. That's the biggest city in Cordillera, in the north of the Luzon Island, where is the indigenous area. So we had to take, at that time, this was 6 or 7 hours by bus from Manila to Baguio, and then from Baguio to Lagawe. That's a smaller city that closer to in the Ifugao province where we were going to. It took us another 5 hours by minibus, and then from Lagawe we had to take motorcycle One by one, the community members, they took us one by motorcycle to their community. It took us another 2 or 3 hours to take the motorcycle, which was fun, but then it was a long journey, long trip. And then we were there, and the locals, the community members told us that we were the second group of foreigners who ever entered their community. The first people who ever enter their communities are those people who trying to check out the site where they are going to build the dam. So we were the second group of people, foreigners they've ever seen in their community. And one of the elders told us that they were actually quite, what's that word? They didn't think they can fight against the project. So the reason why they wanted us to make a documentary for them is that they want us to make a record of the scenarios, the communities, the daily lives they have. So one day, once their community is flooded because of the dam, then they still have something to show their children and to show their grandchildren. So that's the beginning of the story. And so that we stayed there for a week. But the more we talk to the locals, the more we learn about the whole thing. It just turned out to be there a lot more to really reveal the fact about what's going on with all these deals, and also what's going on with the process of the free prior informed consent that is enshrined in the Declaration of the Rights of Indigenous Peoples by the United Nations. So in the Philippines, they also have this Indigenous Peoples' Rights Act that asks all these kinds of development projects, they need to obtain the consent from the people, especially indigenous communities who would be affected. So they have this process. But then the community members, they were told by the local officials that you should say conditionally yes in order to protect your land. But they never give the reason why. And they don't, actually for the community members, they didn't understand. First, they didn't understand what is free prior informed consent. They didn't even know there's this act in the Philippines that to protect, in a way, the rights of indigenous peoples. And of course, they didn't know what does that mean by conditionally yes. So with this process, we have the assistance from the local youth organizations and also the farmers, the peasant movement to assist us and also to provide a lot of information to us. But it was quite difficult because we were only there for a week. And we have these language barriers because they don't even speak Tagalog. They spoke their own indigenous languages. So we had to translate 3 or 4 times because of the language. So I have to say, when I look back to this piece of work I did, I could have done a lot more if I can do it again now. But the problem is because at that time we come up with this story, the youth organization used this story as a tool to not to fight against the government, but it's more to educate their own people about what would happen to different communities once this, it's called Alimik Dam Project. Once this project is going through, and also the impact, and also they are trying to tell people that besides conditionally yes, we can also say no. There should be different answers from different people, and also there should be more information about this whole project. So they use it as an educational tool to the indigenous societies in the Philippines. And then next year in 2018, we were again to the Philippines to do another project. This time we were really prepared to do more like an investigation work to another dam project in another province in the Cordillera region. But then we couldn't really finish that because we were followed by policemen. And there are military guys, they went to our hotels and asked to check to get our passports and all these things. So we couldn't really because we were followed everywhere. So we couldn't really, for the safety concern of the locals, so we couldn't really interview them at that time. So we couldn't finish that. And after we came back from the Philippines in 2018, I was not able to go back again until now because the safety concerns. So yeah, that's the thing. But it also showed that how we were thinking that maybe that was because this piece of work we did in 2017 that really indeed has some impact. That was why we were targeted in 2018 when we were trying to do another story. But also, yesterday I was in a panel to talk about investigating Asia, and one of the panelists saying that we, of course, for us is agenda setting, but more importantly is agenda keeping, that we keep following up with this project. So with this Alimi Dam, because of this, one of the reasons is that because we have this piece of work, so they can really showcase to the indigenous communities what is going on. So they kind of technically delay the process of getting consent from the peoples, because for the movement, they need more time to allow people to understand what is going on before they really say yes or no, or conditionally yes, conditionally no. So they kind of technically delay the whole process. And then the whole project was delayed because of the pandemic, because all these constructions things, they cannot get into the site because of pandemic. And the latest news about this project is that 2 days ago, they announced this company is going to work with the Filipino government on an assessment study regarding if this dam project can also help with mitigate the risk of flood in that area. It sounds a bit weird for me, but anyway, at least the whole project is delayed until now, and the elders, they can still show their children and grandchildren like the real scenery of their community instead of only be able to show it on the screen.
Kia ora. Thank you, Tuhi.